Hi, my name is Austin Porter. I'm a visiting assistant professor, and my 4-minute lecture today is on the history of photography. Yes, photography. It's about 175 years old, which sounds old, but really isn't that old at all. And I think this is an interesting subject because we are surrounded by photographs today, arguably more now than we ever have been before. They are ubiquitous in our society. So I think it's an interesting question to ask, how did we get here? What were the sort of technical best hits, or greatest hits rather, of the history of photography? The process begins in 1839 with the invention of the daguerreotype in France. A daguerreotype is essentially a small piece of metal that has been chemically fixed to hold an image. The good thing about the daguerreotype is that it provides, when done right, it provides a high level of detail. The bad thing is that you can't make copies, and they're fairly fragile, so they required a small little, typically leather sort of case that was protected by a small piece of glass. Another kind of photographic image that was created in the 1830s was referred to as the calotype. Now the calotype created a small paper negative. The good thing about the calotype was because of these paper negatives you could make multiple copies of the same image. The bad thing about the calotype was that they were very fuzzy images, and those negatives tended to break down. So in the second half of the 19th century, you begin to see the development of glass negatives. These are literal sheets of glass that have been chemically treated to hold an image, the image that is before the camera. So you would put this glass negative into a camera and then use that negative to print multiple copies of that same image. This was a much better process than had been developed before. It allowed for multiple prints of images, a great deal of detail, but no color, no motion, and it was very, very cumbersome. Often this is the sort of process you think of with the sort of the hood over the head of the photographer, and often a darkroom that has to be portable. Things really changed in the 1920s with the development of 35mm film. So you went from a glass negative where you could make multiple copies to 35mm film where you could take multiple photographs in sequence. This also really helped photographers because 35mm film was much smaller, could be in a roll, and the camera itself was much smaller. So you were much more mobile. You could be sort of secretive if you needed to be. And it was also at this time where photographs became increasingly easily inserted into print media. So think in the 1930s, for example, of publications such as Life magazine, Fortune magazine, etc. You would have these huge photographs or photo essays with photojournalism and then also photographic advertisements. So fast forward another, say, 50, 60 years and you have digital photography. This gets developed in the late 1980s and then was commercially viable in the 1990s. And of course with digital photography, the chemical process is essentially eliminated, such as the image that you're all watching me on now, sort of a second cousin removed from those early digital photographs. There is no need necessarily to actually print off a physical photograph. It is taken, recorded, and distributed through a digital process from beginning to end. So to recap, from this whole process for the last 175 years, you need a photographer with some sort of camera, some sort of substrate onto which you can present this, and of course an audience. So as we move into the 21st century, I hope that we're all learning to develop our visual literacy and keeping this history of the mechanical and digitally reproduced image in mind.